Deep in Africa's largest lake sits a barren rock the size of half a football field. It has no topsoil, no fresh water, and barely enough room to walk. Yet hundreds of people are crammed onto it, sparking a bitter, ongoing military standoff between Kenya and Uganda. Why? Because the deep waters surrounding this tiny metallic slum hold a billion-dollar geographic secret. To understand the sheer absurdity of Magingo Island, we have to first zoom way out and look at the massive body of water that surrounds it, Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is a geographic behemoth, covering roughly 68,800 square kilometers, or about 26,600 square miles. It's the largest lake in Africa, the largest tropical lake in the entire world, and the second largest freshwater lake on the planet. To put that in perspective, Lake Victoria is roughly the same size as the entire Republic of Ireland. It's less of a lake and more of an inland sea, complete with its own microclimates, massive storms, and distinct archipelagos. But large bodies of water have a funny habit of creating complex geopolitical borders. Lake Victoria is shared by 3 East African nations. The southern half of the lake, about 51%, belongs to Tanzania. The northwestern quadrant, about 43%, belongs to Uganda. Kenya, despite bordering a massive stretch of the lake's eastern edge, claims only a tiny 6% sliver of the water. But here's where things start to get legally and geographically murky. How exactly do you draw a permanent border on moving water? During the early 20th century, British colonial administrators mapped out the borders separating the Kenya colony from the Uganda protectorate. According to the 1926 Order in Council, the official border was drawn as a straight line across the water, pointing towards specific geographic landmarks on the mainland and islands. On paper, it seemed like a perfectly logical way to divide a lake. However, straight lines drawn on colonial maps rarely translate perfectly to the physical realities of the natural world. And hiding right along that invisible, poorly defined maritime border, deep inside that tiny 6% Kenyan sliver of the lake, was a cluster of rocks that no one at the time thought twice about. This is where we find Magingo. Magingo Island is located just off the eastern shore of Lake Victoria. The nearest mainland is Muhuro Bay in Kenya, which is roughly a 2-hour boat ride away depending on the weather. From the water, the island looks like an anomaly. It doesn't feature the gentle sloping beaches or lush vegetation of the other islands in the region. Instead, Magingo is essentially a jagged, barren pyramid of a rock jutting abruptly out of the deep water. Geologically speaking, it's nothing more than a localized upthrust of rock, stripped bare by centuries of wind and water erosion. Before human settlement, it had 0 topsoil, 0 vegetation, and 0 natural resources. There's no natural spring for fresh water. There isn't even enough flat ground to comfortably pitch a tent. Magingo Island covers an area of roughly 2,000 square meters. That's exactly half an acre. To visualize this, imagine a standard American football field. Now, cut that field entirely in half. That half field represents the absolute maximum surface area of Magingo Island. In fact, if you were to walk around at a normal, casual pace, you'd cross the entire island from end to end in about 30 seconds. It's microscopically small, incredibly isolated, and has no natural resources. So why on earth would anyone care about this barren piece of stone, let alone fight over it? The answer lies in the water around the rock, but we'll get to that. Perhaps the most fascinating and bizarre aspect of Magingo's physical geography isn't the island itself, but its immediate surroundings. Magingo does not sit alone in this part of Lake Victoria. It's part of a tiny micro-archipelago of 3 distinct islands. Just a short distance away is Pyramid Island, a steep, virtually unscalable rock formation that marks the official, undisputed border between Kenya and Uganda. But right next to Magingo, literally a stone's throw away, separated by a mere 200 meters of water, is another island called Usingo. Usingo is everything that Magingo is not. It's significantly larger, it has relatively flat topography, it has a layer of topsoil capable of supporting vegetation, with green grass and trees growing naturally on its surface. By every geographic metric, Usingo is vastly superior to Magingo. If you were marooned in this part of Lake Victoria and had to choose a place to survive, Usingo would be the obvious, undisputed choice. Yet Usingo Island is completely uninhabited. To understand why people chose this barren rock over the green island, we have to look past the physical geography and dive into the bizarre, lore-filled human history of Magingo. Who were the first people brave or crazy enough to settle on this half acre of stone? And what dark rumors kept them from settling on the lush island right next door? The human history of Magingo Island doesn't begin with a grand explorer planting a flag hundreds or thousands of years ago. It actually begins in 1991 with 2 Kenyan fishermen named Dalmas Tembo and George Kabebe. According to local lore, when these 2 men arrived in this remote stretch of Lake Victoria, they needed a place to set up a base camp, but they absolutely refused to set foot on the lush, inviting island of Usingo. Why? Because local legend dictated that Usingo, along with nearby Pyramid Island, was home to malevolent spirits. Fishermen whispered that demons stalked the shores of the greener islands, and that anyone who dared settle there would be plagued by illness or dragged down to a watery grave. So, Tembo and Kibebe opted for the barren rock. To ensure their safety and appease the spirits, it's said they even performed a ritual sacrifice, offering a rooster, goats, and wine, before claiming the half-acre of stone as their own. For over a decade, this bizarre arrangement seemed to work. A few Kenyan fishermen used the rock as a temporary demon-free base, braving the elements. But history, especially when it comes to borders, is rarely just one side of the story. Enter Uganda's version of events. If you ask officials in Kampala, the Kenyan origin story is nothing more than a localized myth. According to Uganda, a Ugandan fisherman named Joseph Subuga arrived on Magingo in 2004. When he pulled his boat up onto the jagged rocks, he claimed he found the island completely deserted. He set up camp, and soon after, other Ugandan fishermen joined him. In their view, they were the true pioneers of Magingo. Now we have two competing origin stories, two groups of fishermen from two different countries, each claiming that they were the rightful founders of a half-acre slab of stone. But for a long time, neither the Kenyan government in Nairobi nor the Ugandan government in Kampala cared about these localized squabbles. Magingo was completely off the geopolitical radar. It was a worthless rock. To understand the sudden human scramble for Magingo, you have to understand the ecological history of Lake Victoria. Back in the 1950s and 60s, British colonial officials introduced a non-native fish species into the lake, the Nile perch. The Nile perch is an absolute monster of a fish. It can grow up to 2 meters long and weigh over 200 kilograms. As a voracious apex predator, the Nile perch rapidly decimated the native fish populations of Lake Victoria. Ecologically speaking, it was a disaster, but economically, it triggered a fishy gold rush. By the early 2000s, a massive global demand for Nile perch had exploded. European and Asian markets couldn't get enough of its mild, fleshy white meat. Suddenly, catching Nile perch became the most lucrative business in the entire region. Local fishermen began calling it the white gold of Lake Victoria. And as fate would have it, the deep, cool waters directly surrounding the tiny rock of Magingo happen to be one of the absolute richest Nile perch fishing grounds in the entire 68,800 square kilometer lake. Almost overnight, the narrative shifted. Magingo was no longer a worthless barren rock. It was a lucrative port sitting right in the middle of a multi-million-dollar fishery. It was the ultimate staging ground. If you controlled Magingo, you controlled the white gold. The secret was out. Fishermen started pouring in by the dozens, then the hundreds. But with massive amounts of money flowing through a tiny, lawless rock in the middle of a massive lake, a new, much more dangerous element arrived: pirates. Seeing fishermen hauling in daily fortunes in Nile perch, armed bandits began terrorizing the waters around Magingo. They would hijack boats at gunpoint, steal the expensive outboard motors, and take the valuable fish, sometimes leaving the fishermen stranded to drown in the deep water. The desperate fishermen on Magingo begged their governments for help. In 2004, the Ugandan government answered the call. They sent armed maritime police to the island, set up a permanent presence, and raised the Ugandan flag. They effectively crushed the piracy. But then they decided to stay. Ugandan forces began heavily taxing the Kenyan fishermen, charging them for fishing permits and exerting total administrative control over the rock. When news reached Nairobi that Ugandan troops had planted a flag and were taxing Kenyans on what Kenya believed was its sovereign territory, the Kenyan government was furious. They pointed back to the 1926 colonial maps. Uganda pointed right back, claiming the island fell entirely within its own maritime borders. The geopolitical powder keg was officially lit. What started as a myth about demons had escalated into what the media would later dub Africa's smallest war. The flags were raised, the troops were mobilized, but as the two governments prepared to clash over this half-acre of rock, the fishermen caught in the middle made a shocking decision. Today, if you approach Magingo Island by boat, you can no longer see the jagged, barren rock that the original settlers claimed. In fact, you can barely see any rock at all. From a distance, Magingo looks less like an island and more like a giant metallic turtle floating in the middle of Lake Victoria. Every single square inch of the 2,000 square meter surface has been covered by structures made of corrugated iron sheets and scrap wood. The shacks are stacked so tightly together that their rusty roofs overlap, creating a continuous, glittering canopy of metal under the equatorial sun. Current estimates suggest that anywhere from 400 to 500 people live permanently on this half-acre of rock, though some estimates put it as high as 1,800. To put that into perspective, if you took the population density of Magingo and applied it to a standard square mile, you would have well over 250,000 people crammed into that space. It makes Manhattan look like a sprawling countryside. Because space is non-existent, the streets of Magingo are nothing more than narrow, dark crevices between the iron shacks. You have to walk single file, ducking under low-hanging roofs and stepping over fishing gear. Yet, inside this metallic maze, a fully functioning, albeit bizarre, microcity has emerged. Tucked into these narrow, claustrophobic alleyways, you'll find 4 separate pubs, a pharmacy, a hair salon, various food stalls, and several brothels. It's a high-energy, high-stress frontier town. But there is a glaring, dangerous downside to living on a rock with zero natural resources. There's no plumbing, no natural fresh water, and no electricity grid, save for a few noisy gas-powered generators. Every single drop of drinking water, every piece of food that isn't fish, every roll of toilet paper, and every drop of fuel has to be imported by boat from the mainland. And because there's no waste management system, the sanitation conditions are, to put it mildly, concerning. The waters immediately surrounding the island are heavily polluted, requiring residents to boat out to the deeper lake just to find clean water. So we return to the ultimate question: why would somewhere around 500 people choose to live in a cramped, unsanitary iron sheet slum in the middle of a massive lake, while the green, lush island of Usingo sits completely empty just a stone's throw away? Furthermore, why do they stay when the geopolitical tension is hovering right over their heads? Let's address that geopolitical tension first. Thankfully, the smallest war in Africa never actually erupted into a full-scale military conflict, but it did result in one of the most awkward geopolitical arrangements on the planet. Today, both Kenya and Uganda claim the island. To keep the peace, they reached a fragile co-management agreement. If you walk through the tiny alleys of Magingo today, you'll find both Kenyan police officers and Ugandan police officers stationed on the rock. They patrol the exact same half-acre of land, eyeing each other warily, each enforcing their own country's rules on their respective citizens. It's a bizarre, tense standoff compressed into the size of half a football field.